All right, so let's jump right into this. Today we're diving deep into global politics, specifically how some of Trump's recent actions might impact Canada. It's only day 3 of his second term, and, well, the news is already buzzing with his executive orders and policy shifts. So we're going to break down what we know so far and what it all could mean for Canada. Don't forget to subscribe to Le Podcast de Philippe on YouTube. Okay, so January 23rd, 2025, Trump's back in the Oval Office, and he wastes no time making some big moves.
Yeah, it's really striking how quickly he's pushing through these policies, especially ones that could have global repercussions.
And one of the biggest headlines, of course, is the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. He says it's all about putting American oil and gas first. But how does that affect Canada, considering they're still committed to the agreement?
Well, you're going to see a policy mismatch in North America right away. Canadian companies focusing on green technology, they might suddenly find themselves at a disadvantage. I mean, their American competitors might have way fewer regulations to deal with. That could influence everything from investment decisions to how much it costs to develop and use these green
It's
technologies.
like a whole new playing field, practically overnight. And then there's the withdrawal from the World Health Organization. I mean, given everything that's happened with global health in recent years, that feels huge.
Right, and it raises serious questions about pandemic preparedness going forward and how Canada and the US will cooperate on health issues. Think about it. If a new health threat emerges, historically, these two countries work together pretty closely. They share information, resources, but this withdrawal, well, it could throw a wrench in those collaborations. It potentially leaves both countries much more vulnerable.
It's like taking a step back after all the progress that's been made. And on top of all that, he just revoked almost 80 of Biden's executive orders.
It's a massive policy reversal covering so many different areas. This is a sharp turn ideologically, and it just creates this uncertainty about where U.S. policy is headed.
Yeah.
Canada now has to figure out how to adjust to this constantly shifting environment, and they might even have to reassess their own strategies when it comes to trade, environmental protection, you name it.
And then there's the issue that everyone's talking about, Trump reiterating his promise to pardon those involved in the January 6th Capitol riot.
It's a move that's incredibly divisive. It has the potential to split American society even further, maybe even lead to more unrest. And for Canada, any instability in the U.S. directly impacts them. They have such close ties economically and socially, the flow of goods, services, people across the border. Any disruption to that could have huge consequences for Canada's economy and society as a whole.
So let's talk about how this potential U.S. instability might actually affect everyday Canadians. What about migration?
Well, with Trump expected to tighten immigration policies, there's a good chance more people will look to Canada for refuge or residency. It's not a brand new thing. People have always sought refuge in Canada, but the sheer number of people could be different this time around. Imagine a sudden surge in applications. It would strain the Canadian immigration system. You might see longer wait times for processing, more scrutiny of applicants, and maybe even a shift in priorities for what kind of immigration they're focusing on.
And what about Canadians who are already living in the U.S.? How might these changes to immigration policy affect them?
That's the question a lot of Canadians are asking themselves right now. Any changes to visa requirements, work permits, even access to healthcare and education, it all has a big impact on their lives. Some might decide to come back to Canada, others might be stuck in limbo, unsure about their future in the U.S. It's a situation that needs close attention, and we have to really consider the consequences.
Absolutely. And then there's the area of artificial intelligence. The Trump administration is pumping a ton of money into AI, and that could create some real competition with Canada, a country that's been right at the forefront of AI research and development.
Oh, absolutely. This competition could play out in different ways, from attracting the best talent to securing funding for research and development. Think about it. Canadian AI startups might struggle to compete with U.S. companies that have tons of cash and government support. This could lead to a brain drain, with Canadian researchers and entrepreneurs heading south for better opportunities.
But couldn't this competition be a good thing, at least in some ways? I mean, competition often drives innovation, right?
That's true. It's definitely a possibility. This situation might push both countries to invest more in research, maybe lead to some big breakthroughs, and ultimately advance AI at a faster pace. But it also raises questions about how they'll work together. Will Canada and the U.S. still share their knowledge and expertise, or will this race for dominance create barriers to collaboration?
It's a delicate balance, for sure. And speaking of balance, we have to talk about border security.
With Trump putting so much emphasis on the U.S.-Mexico border, There's a concern that the US-Canada border might be neglected. That could impact everything from trade to security cooperation. Imagine longer wait times at border crossings, increased scrutiny of goods and people, and maybe even fewer joint security initiatives.
And we can't forget about the potential rise of extremist groups in the U.S., especially given the pardons for those involved in the January 6th riot.
Right. That's a worrying trend that could make things even more complicated when it comes to border security. Canada might need to rethink its security strategies, improve intelligence sharing, maybe even beef up their own border security measures to deal with potential threats.
So there's a lot to unpack here. It's like Trump's actions are this political earthquake, and the aftershocks are reaching all the way up to Canada. But before we get too deep into the specifics, let's take a step back and see how the rest of the world is reacting. What are other countries saying about all of this?
Well, the early responses from Europe seem pretty cautious, even apprehensive. There's a sense of vulnerability, a concern that Trump's unpredictable actions could disrupt global alliances and create new friction points.
We're also seeing concerns specifically about Trump supporters like Elon Musk potentially interfering in other countries, especially with his alleged support for the German far right.
That's right. Some European leaders are even talking about temporarily restricting access to platforms like Twitter, which Musk owns, to try and limit misinformation and potential political manipulation. It's a drastic step, but it shows how worried they are and how these actions could ripple far beyond U.S. borders.
It feels like the whole world is waiting to see what happens next.
Definitely. These first few actions are sending shockwaves through global politics. It reminds everyone that the U.S. is still a major player, and what they do has huge consequences. For Canada, it means adapting to a new set of realities, trying to anticipate challenges, and looking for potential opportunities. It's a complex situation, always changing, and it requires careful navigation.
So let's dig a little deeper into how Canada might respond. We've talked about potential increases in migration, but what about the economic impact of all this? After all, Canada and the U.S. have the biggest bilateral trading relationship in the world.
That's true, and any major policy shift in the U.S., particularly in areas like trade and energy, is bound to affect Canada's economy. Take the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement, for example. It puts Canada in a tough spot. Their commitment to climate action could actually become a point of tension with the U.S., especially if American businesses face fewer regulations and become more competitive as a result.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, Canada might be at an economic disadvantage, but on the other hand, they could position themselves as a leader in sustainability and attract investment in green technologies.
You've got it. It's all about finding that balance, protecting Canadian interests while still having a good relationship with their biggest trading partner. It's a challenge, for sure, but it's also a chance for Canada to showcase their commitment to sustainability and innovation.
And we can't forget about the social and cultural connections between the two countries. Millions of Canadians have family and friends in the U.S. and vice versa. How might these political shifts affect those personal ties?
That's such an important point. The social fabric between these two countries is so tightly woven. If things get more politically polarized, and if travel restrictions tighten, those personal connections could be strained. And that leads to social and emotional consequences that are hard to measure but really significant. It reminds us that politics isn't just about abstract policies, it's about people's lives, their relationships, their hopes and fears.
It's about real people, real connections, real emotions.
Exactly. And in times like these, with so much change and uncertainty, it's more important than ever to consider how these political shifts affect people. It's about understanding how these events impact individuals, families, and communities on both sides of the border.
So where do we go from here? We've covered a lot, from the challenges and opportunities to the economic implications, even the social and personal dimensions of this political shakeup. It's pretty clear that Trump's return to the White House is going to have a huge impact on Canada. But how will Canada respond?
That's the big question, and honestly, only time will tell. But one thing's for sure, Canada needs to be strategic, adaptable, and resilient to face these challenges. They need to play to their strengths, build new partnerships, and most importantly, stay true to their values.
And as Canadians figure out how to navigate this new reality, it's important to remember they're not alone. The whole world is watching, and many are curious to see how Canada responds to these unprecedented events.
Absolutely. Canada has a chance to show the world what they stand for, to demonstrate their commitment to democracy, diversity, and international cooperation. It's an opportunity to lead by example and inspire others to do the same.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a few key takeaways. First, Trump's actions are already rippling beyond the U.S., and Canada is feeling those effects acutely. Second, Canada faces both challenges and opportunities in this new political landscape, and how they respond will require careful thought and strategic action. And finally, this is just the beginning. Things are changing fast, and we'll keep a close eye on how things develop right here on Le Podcast de Philippe.
And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more in-depth analysis and insights. We'll be back soon with part 2 of our deep dive into the impact of Trump's actions on Canada. Stay tuned.
Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay curious about the world around you.
Picking up right where we left off, let's look at how Canada might navigate this tricky situation.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, but are there any potential upsides for Canada here?
One big opportunity for Canada is their history of supporting multilateralism. With the U.S. kind of going it alone these days, Canada can step up and really champion international cooperation.
So instead of going solo, Canada could team up with other countries that share similar values.
Exactly. Think about countries in Europe and Asia that are on the same page as Canada. They could work together on things like climate change, trade, security. Not only would that counterbalance some of the shifting global power dynamics, but it would also give Canada a bigger voice on the world stage.
So strength in numbers. I like it. But what about putting this into action? How can Canada actually make this multilateralism thing work?
Well, one way is to get more involved in international organizations like the World Trade Organization or the United Nations. Canada can be more proactive in shaping global trade rules and diplomatic norms. This would let them advocate for their own interests and make sure their voice is heard.
So Canada could use these platforms to push for policies that align with their values, things like free trade, human rights, environmental protection.
Exactly. And on top of that, they can also focus on building stronger relationships with individual countries. That could mean new trade agreements, collaborating on research projects, even providing development assistance.
It sounds like Canada has a chance to become a real leader on the global stage. But what about things back home? What can Canada do domestically to prepare for the economic and social fallout from Trump's policies?
That's a crucial question. Investing in their workforce is key. Think about how automation and technology are changing the job market. Canada needs to make sure their workers have the skills to adapt and thrive in this new economy.
So investing in education, skills development, that's got to be a priority.
Absolutely. And they also need to strengthen their social safety net, making sure Canadians have access to affordable healthcare, education, and housing, even if things get rocky economically.
So basically building a more resilient and equitable society.
Exactly. It's about creating a system that supports Canadians when things get tough and gives everyone a chance to succeed.
Now let's talk about environmental policy. With the U.S. backing out of the Paris Agreement, how can Canada still stick to its climate commitments?
It's a tough one, but it's also an opportunity. They can keep implementing their own climate policies, invest in renewable energy, promote sustainable practices. This not only helps reduce Canada's carbon footprint, but also shows the world they're serious about climate leadership.
Leading by example, basically.
Right. Plus, they can work with other countries and even local governments like states and provinces to keep climate action moving forward. This could mean sharing what works, collaborating on research, even setting up carbon pricing systems.
So it sounds like Canada has a lot of options, both domestically and internationally. But I'm guessing there are some pretty big roadblocks ahead, too.
Definitely. Navigating this new political reality is going to take careful planning, strategic thinking, and a willingness to adapt. Canada will have to make tough decisions, balance different interests, and be ready for unexpected hurdles.
It's a high-stakes game, and the stakes just got even higher.
Absolutely. But Canada's been through tough times before, and they've always come out stronger. They have a lot to work with: a stable democracy, a diverse and talented population, a commitment to working with other countries.
So even with all the uncertainty, there's reason to be optimistic.
For sure. Canada has what it takes to not just survive this, but to come out as a global leader in the years ahead. It's an exciting time to be Canadian, and I'm really interested to see what the future holds.
That's a great place to pause this part of our deep dive. But before we jump into the final part, don't forget to subscribe to Le Podcast de Philippe on YouTube for even more analysis and insights. We'll be back soon with part 3, where we'll explore some possible scenarios for Canada's future in this new global order. Stay tuned.
Okay, so we've covered the challenges and opportunities for Canada in this new Trump era. But what could the future actually look like? Let's play out some scenarios. One possibility is that Canada goes all in on multilateralism. Really strengthens those bonds with like-minded countries in Europe and Asia. Picture a network of nations dedicated to free trade, human rights, environmental protection, that kind of thing. It could be a way to balance out the US's more isolationist approach, and it would create new opportunities for Canadian businesses and workers.
So like a global team of progressive countries.
Exactly. They could tackle shared challenges together, things like climate change, cybersecurity, you name it. And Canada could be right at the forefront, shaping the agenda and pushing for a more inclusive and sustainable world order.
That sounds pretty optimistic, but what if things go south? What if the U.S. becomes even more protectionist and isolationist under Trump?
Well, in that case, Canada might have to deal with some serious economic hurdles. Trade disputes could heat up, investments could dry up, and the Canadian economy could take a hit.
So we're talking about a potential trade war with the U.S.
It's on the table, but it's not a foregone conclusion. Even if things get tense, there would still be room for cooperation and communication. Canada would have to be smart about it, focusing on key sectors and markets while also branching out to new trading partners.
Makes sense. But beyond the economic side of things, what about the social and cultural impact?
Well, one worry is that all the political division in the U.S. could start spilling over into Canada. Imagine a rise in anti-immigrant feelings or a pushback against progressive values. That could create social rifts and damage Canada's image as a tolerant and welcoming society.
So essentially a threat to the very fabric of Canadian society.
It's a risk they need to be aware of and address proactively. Canada would need to double down on its commitment to diversity, inclusion, and human rights. And they'd also need to encourage open dialogue and understanding between different communities.
Sounds like there are a lot of potential traps along the way. How can Canada avoid getting caught in the middle of these global power struggles?
Strong leadership is crucial. They need leaders with vision who can navigate these complex issues and make tough decisions. These leaders need to be able to build consensus, communicate effectively, and inspire confidence both domestically and internationally.
So leadership is key, got it. But what else might influence Canada's success in this new world?
Being adaptable is huge. They need to be flexible and responsive to change, willing to tweak their strategies and policies as things unfold. That means embracing innovation, trying new things, and learning from both their wins and their losses.
So being nimble and quick on their feet.
Exactly. And of course, they need resilience. There will be bumps in the road, but they have to stay focused on their values and their vision for the future.
Resilience, adaptability, strong leadership, all critical traits. But what about the average Canadian? What can they do to help shape the future?
Well, first and foremost, they can stay informed and engaged, follow the news, participate in discussions, hold their elected officials accountable. They can also support organizations and initiatives that align with their values, whether that's environmental protection, social justice, international development, anything they care about.
So basically, be active citizens and participate in the democratic process.
Exactly. And on a more personal level, they can embrace values like diversity, inclusion, and respect. They can build bridges between communities, challenge prejudice and discrimination, and work toward a more just and fair society.
It sounds like we all have a part to play in shaping what comes next.
We absolutely do. The future isn't set in stone. It's shaped by the choices we make and the actions we take. And by working together, Canadians can build a future that's prosperous, inclusive, and sustainable.
That's a message of hope and empowerment right there.
It is. The challenges are real, but so are the opportunities. And I truly believe Canada has the potential to not just overcome these challenges, but to become an even stronger, more vibrant nation because of them.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into how Trump's actions might impact Canada. It's been a fascinating conversation, and we've covered a lot of ground.
It has. And I hope our listeners have gained a better understanding of what Canada's up against and what opportunities lie ahead.
And if you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to Le Podcast de Philippe on YouTube for more in-depth analysis and insights. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the issues that matter most. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay informed.
And stay hopeful. The future is ours to create.